it could descend into chaos. The stakes are high. And this is an unfolding example of using the combined assets of smart power: diplomacy, development, and defense.
So that's Hillary Clinton. As I just mentioned, senior U.S. defense officials appeared to play down the potential for military action in Libya. The U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, speaking alongside the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Mike Mullen, said that several U.S. Navy ships have been redirected to the Mediterranean and 400 Marines from the U.S. have been sent to the region. Gates also said the United States has to think about whether its military can deploy to another country. And Mullen said that setting up a no-fly zone over Libya would be a, quote, extraordinarily complex operation to set up. Here's the U.S. Defense Secretary.
I would note that the UN Security Council resolution provides no authorization for the use of armed force. There is no unanimity within NATO for the use of armed force. And the kinds of options that have been talked about in the press and elsewhere also have their own consequences.
All right, those are all the voices we've heard. Let's analyze it a little bit now. We can speak to Rosalind Jordan about how much political will there is on Capitol Hill for action from the United States government. What sort of appetite is there, Rosalind?
Well, there's sort of a middling appetite, Nick, here on Capitol Hill, and that's partly for two reasons: Iraq and Afghanistan. The U.S. government is trying to wind down, it says, the war in Iraq. The war in Afghanistan is due for some sort of revision in terms of troop levels in mid-July or late July, and that begs the question: if the U.S. were to sign on to any sort of joint effort to impose a no-fly zone over Libya, does it have the staff? Does it have the equipment to take part in such a mission? Perhaps just as important, would there be popular support for it? The reading that we're getting here on Capitol Hill is that some people think that it is necessary for moral reasons. Other people seem to think that the last thing that the U.S. government needs to be doing right now is going into any sort of military action, even if the overall goal is one to protect people.
Yeah, right. And we all know, the United States knows all too well, doesn't it, that military intervention can go wrong, can go horribly wrong.
It can, and in fact, some of the commentary coming from members of the Republican Party indicates that perhaps they have learned a lesson, especially in the wake of the way that the U.S. led the war against Iraq back in 2003. We're hearing such things as we need to be measured, we need to be considered, we need to examine whether or not using a no-fly zone is the most accurate, most effective way, I should say, of saving lives in Libya. So that discussion is starting, but really it is being overshadowed, Nick, by the fact that the government still does not have a budget for the current year, 2011, and they're trying to start a discussion about next year's budget. So as long as people are concerned about the economy, about the amount of federal spending here in the United States, it's not clear just yet just how prominent this discussion could turn. But just as we have seen with events across the greater Middle East in the past several weeks, this could become a much bigger issue very quickly. Really, it depends on the events on the ground there in Libya.
Yeah, Rosalind, a lot of big domestic issues on the agenda as well as Libya. Appreciate that. Thanks a lot. Rosalind Jordan, Capitol Hill. Let's unravel this a little more. Joining me in the studio is Scott Carpenter, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and now a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Mr. Carpenter, welcome to the program.
Thanks.
It's an interesting position now, isn't it? On the one hand, we've got Hillary Clinton saying all options are on the table, and then you've got Robert Gates saying, look, there's no sanction for military intervention, and anyway, the complexities of a no-fly zone are just enormous.
Well, I think that this reflects the policy of this administration, that it would like to have Security Council backing for any step that it would take. But it does put them in a bit of a bind because the administration has adopted some very strong language about the fact that Libya has no room in it for Gaddafi to remain. The President of the United States saying he has to leave immediately. So, and as this unfolding humanitarian crisis develops and perhaps gets worse, I think the pressure on the United States to lead in the Security Council an effort to explore what additional steps might be taken, I think will become critical.
And one of those, of course, is the no-fly zone, but that seems pretty unlikely given China's likely stance on it. So assuming that doesn't happen, what next?
Well, this is the big question of the administration, because as I say, their lodestone here is the Security Council. If the Security Council does not give them authorization, I don't think that they do anything. And this is a big problem for the Obama administration. Samantha Power, who has written the book on genocide, does not want to see a major humanitarian crisis take place in Libya. And when I met with a group of people at the White House last week, it was clear that they believed that a no-fly zone was going to be imposed in some way, that they could get there from here. I think that it's not as complex as the Secretary makes it out to be, given the fact that the Libyan Air Force and its related helicopters are based in very specific places, so that you wouldn't have to enforce a no-fly zone long. And in fact, I mean, the Libyans themselves have done a masterful job at standing up to Muammar Gaddafi and taking back their country from his leadership. So I don't think that it would require a whole heck of a lot of effort, and certainly no one's contemplating putting boots on the ground there.
The problem is, though, with the no-fly zone, that, as I say, in the first place, that China might not vote for it, so it wouldn't get through the UN Security Council anyway. And even if it did, then you'd have all sorts of ensuing problems. There could be opposition aircraft in the sky. It could be a nightmare.
Well, it's interesting because you have the Arab League, which has called for a no-fly zone. I mean, I can't envision the Egyptian Air Force enforcing such a thing, but they do have F-16 fighters. So there are multilateral approaches that might be taken, but again, I think the administration is anchored in the Security Council. I don't think it would act unilaterally with Europe and NATO without such a provision. I don't think that they would be supportive of an Arab League no-fly zone being enforced by Egypt, but that's a possibility.
Right. Do you agree with the Secretary's statement when she says that this situation could go two ways? It could either go to democracy, or it could descend into civil war and chaos?
Well, I think Libya under Gaddafi has had a serious weakening of any sort of institutions. There are no political parties. There are no labor unions. There are no elements or institutions that meaningfully guide the state. And so I think it is certainly possible that if you have an imminent collapse, that you could have chaos and a requirement of the international community to come behind to help fill a vacuum that might otherwise be left there. So that's certainly a prospect. But I have been surprised by how peaceful and how quickly order has returned to places where Gaddafi's people have been evicted. In Benghazi, for instance. It's true that there are a lot of refugees, but not as many as I thought there would be by this point in time, because it's possible that the whole country could evacuate based on economic and humanitarian.
But it is this uneasy standoff, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that what you're seeing is the constriction of Gaddafi to the city of Tripoli. He still controls some of the roads around Tripoli, but that's about it. And if we can cordon him off there, or if the Libyans themselves can cordon him off there and patiently work to unseat him with international pressure mounting, maybe we don't need to be worried about this no-fly zone. But if he uses his remaining air assets against the oil fields, for instance, robbing Libya of their patrimony, if he turns those air assets against the people in various cities, I think that we're going to look pretty weak when we've ejected them from the